Presenting room for all of us, we have with us the Right Honorable Adrienne Clarkson. Adrienne Clarkson arrived in Canada in 1942 as a refugee from Hong Kong and made the astonishing journey from penniless child to accomplished broadcaster, journalist, and distinguished public servant in a multifaceted lifetime. Her mandate as Governor General is universally acknowledged to have transformed the office, and her energy, enthusiasm, and passion have left an indelible mark on Canada's history. In 2005, Madam Clarkson co-founded the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, ICC, which helps new citizens to become actively involved and included in Canadian life. The Institute hosts 6 Degrees, the global forum on citizenship, immigration, diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the 21st century, which takes place annually in Toronto and its global hubs of Berlin and Mexico City. Madam Clarkson is the best-selling author of the 2014 CBC Massey Lectures, Belonging, the Paradox of Citizenship and Room for All of Us, Surprising Stories of Loss and Transformation, among others. A Privy Councillor and companion of the Order of Canada, Madam Clarkson lives in Toronto with her husband, writer and philosopher, John Ralston Saul. Please give a warm welcome to our Canadian friend, the Right Honorable Adrienne Clarkson.
Hey, I asked for the lights to come up because I really love to see the faces of people I'm talking to. Although I spend a lot of my life under the footlights, and under spotlights, I really like to look at people. I like to see their responses to what I have to say. I wish to acknowledge before we begin that we are gathered today on the occupied territory of the Ohlone people who have stewarded this land for generations, and I recognize that Oakland sits on the territory of the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. By offering this land acknowledgement, I affirm Indigenous sovereignty. I am here today from Toronto, Canada, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples have all come and been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I work to help implement the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada put forward in 2015. And I just want to start by saying, to you Americans here, you know so little about us in Canada, and we know everything about you. As Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau said nearly 50 years ago, being next to the United States for Canada is like a mouse being in bed with an elephant. You just worry every time it breathes deeply that it might roll over on you. My personal story I thought would be of interest as a preamble to what I'm going to tell you about in citizenship and belonging. I came to Canada as a refugee with my Chinese family. I am from the Toisan and Hakka regions of China, but my family is part of a diaspora of Chinese that has been for generations because of poverty in China, living in South America, Indonesia, what's now Indonesia, Peru, and places in Australia. My father was born overseas in Australia, although of Chinese parents. We lost everything in the war in 1941. We were conquered by the Japanese, and we were very fortunate through a fluke of circumstance. You can read it in my autobiography, published by Penguin some years ago, of how we were fortunate enough to get on a boat as stateless people and ended up in Canada. We had one suitcase each. We had lost everything, and we had a wonderful life before us. We didn't know what we were going to. We just knew we were getting out. We went to a country in Canada which was small, white, cold, full of white bread and white people, and yet, curiously, very welcoming. I was very welcomed, and my brother was too, in the public schools. Ottawa in 1942 was the capital of a little country that was at war. And so it was something where people were very conscious if you had lost something in the war that they would take care of you. And that was what I grew up with. I also grew up in a city where my father got a little job in the Federal Civil Service as a clerk in the Oils and Fats Department of Trade and Commerce, and he saw how advantageous it was for people to be bilingual. The French Canadians then were the only ones that seemed to be bilingual, and he said to me when I was 5, you know, you're going to be bilingual in English and French, and the sky will be the limit. And he was right. I grew up with the ideals of public service, as many of my generation in Canada did, because we had a wonderful prime minister called Lester B. Pearson, who brokered the peace deal around the Suez Canal and invented the word peacekeeping, which the United Nations has carried on in a noble way for all these years. And that was something that really colored my generation of people as I went to university, publicly funded university, I need to say. And still our universities are publicly funded, so any of you who want to come to Canada, students, please do. And afterwards you can stay on as immigrants and add to our brain pool. I wanted to learn everything about what had made our country what it was. The bilingualism and the foundation of English and French was very important to me. The Aboriginal foundation, we now call it the triangular pillar, the Aboriginal part was not, when I was growing up, emphasized. We were taught about the fact that there were Aboriginal people. We were given little beaver boards and told to gather pieces of cedar and birch bark so we could make teepees on this beaver board. And they gave us little stick figures and we dressed them in the fur. And they said, this is, you know, the way Indians lived. Nobody told us that 40 miles from Ottawa, there was a reserve, or what you call a reservation in the United States. We never saw a living Indigenous person in Ottawa. And it was as though we were learning about the Greeks and the Romans, about a civilization that had already passed. And I thought that was really very, very odd. I did. And I thought, I'll make up for it sometime, and I have. Now, I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment because of one of my missions as Governor-General. I have a view about what nationalism and small societies are, because I went to study in France when I was 21, and the only nation that is comparable to France in terms of this is the nation state and you fit in it or else is the United States. Basically, the idea of the nation state does not welcome the idea of small languages, small groups of people, and the French put this through in 1548 when they forbade the language, any language except what we now call the French language, the langue d'oeil, actually. And they said, you can't speak Breton, you can't speak Gaelic, you can't speak Normand, you can't speak Provençal, you can't speak Occitan. You must speak only French. You must be monolithic in nature. And a lot of our problems arise from that idea that there must be something monolithic. My life after university, where I was very awakened to things like the world problems because Canada was taking such a role in peacekeeping. In my second year of university, the Hungarian Revolution happened in 1956, and we received 60,000 Hungarians suddenly in southern Ontario, including an entire university. And that made a big impression on us because we thought these people had to flee. These people were not welcome anywhere. These people are, you know, were undocumented, etc. And we took them in, and suddenly we had Doppelstort and good coffee and all sorts of wonderful things done by former professors of engineering and philosophy. When I later came to have a career after doing graduate work in France and England, I went into television totally by accident, which is a story I won't bore you with today, but it is quite exciting. And it was not as a result of affirmative action. I am Chinese, although not as Chinese as I thought. My husband and I did 23andMe out of great curiosity. And when we did 23andMe, I thought I was 75% Chinese because I knew there was a great-grandmother somewhere there in the Australian goldfields who was Irish, and who was probably no better than she should be, because who else would have married somebody Chinese who was doing laundry in some gold rush town, right? And that was always intriguing to me, and I thought, I'm 25% Irish and 75% Chinese, and then 23andMe revealed to me that I was only 68% Chinese, and that I was 3%, are you ready for this? Sardinian. And then 7% Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese really got around, so that didn't really surprise me. And they got around in Asia in a big time way, and they got there first, for one thing, and they also were always very interested in the local cultures and in intermarrying, unlike other colonialists, interestingly enough. I became very well known in Canada from 1965 until 1999 because I went into television, again by a fluke. I did not plan for it. I had worked on my doctorate of English literature and history and art and archaeology, and I was asked one day if I'd like to do a book review on a television program, a daily television program, rather like the Today Show. And I said, sure, why not? And I'd never been in a television studio. I knew nothing about it, but I liked the darkness. I liked the three cameras, and it was a long time ago. I'm 80, okay? So I started in 1965, and these cameras still moved around the floor, and it was marvelous. I loved it. It was like being in another world, like going to the dinosaur park, only you were part of it. And the little red light came on, and you knew you were on camera, and the little red light went on, you knew you were on camera. I loved it. And so I took to it, and it took to me. All I can say is if I hadn't been good at it, they'd have thrown me out in a minute. I have no reservations about saying that they're pretty ruthless people in that kind of world. But I managed, and I started and was successful in a number of shows, including one called The Fifth Estate, which is, after 40 years, still going and winning awards, and is very much like your 60 Minutes. But no affirmative action got me there. There were 45 people who tried out for my first job, and I got it. And so I just thought that was perfectly natural. And I think in Canada, it pretty much was. I later did public service by being Agent General for Ontario in France for 5 years. I chaired the Museum of History, and I was the president of McClelland & Stewart, which is the Canadian publishing company that was extremely famous for a while and was the first publisher of Margaret Atwood, who incidentally is a great friend of mine. I'm name dropping here because she had her finger on the pulse, and when we were 18, and we just turned 80, when we were 18, we met, and she was always going to be a wonderful writer, and she's the one that got me to do 23andMe, because she said, of all the genetic testings, that's the one you have to do, and I listened to everything that she says, because she was brought up by a scientist. Her father was a very famous entomologist. He has 2 insects named after him. Something beetle at Woody and something fly at Woody. Anyway, I was fortunate in being brought up in a country where we met people like that and knew people like that, and it was so terrific. And then I was appointed Governor General in 1999, and everybody said, how did that happen? Well, it's very Canadian. It's also very Australian, very New Zealand. And we have our separate head of state and head of government. So our Prime Minister is the head of government and the de facto person who signs all the laws into being, gives royal assent to all laws in Parliament, opens and closes Parliament, is the Governor-General. And I was Governor-General for 6 years. And so in protocol terms, if it makes it simpler for you to understand, at funerals, like the funeral of President Reagan or the installation of the Pope, I would be seated with your president, the president of Germany, and the kings and queens of Europe. And I was appointed by our wonderful prime minister then, Jean Chrétien. It's a not political post. It's apolitical. And I lived in a wonderful house called Rideau Hall, which, if I do say so myself, looks to me a little more habitable than the White House. But also the offices are all there, but it is a wonderful place. And if you go to Ottawa on a trip, it's open to the public, and you must take a tour of it. I'm very happy with what we did with it when I was there. So you have all these constitutional obligations, but the basic thing that the Governor-General does is to relate Canadians to Canadians. And one of the things I had as my thing was the native peoples, native languages, and the North. Canada is defined by its North. And we make a big mistake if we think we shouldn't live in that kind of climate. We love our climate. Freezing ice and snow, 2 seasons, winter and summer, and we really think that is terrific. And our native people have always showed us how to live there. They showed us how to penetrate the continent when we arrived, and we did not come to Canada in order to do agriculture. We came in the 16th century, the French first came, in order to exploit the beaver, in order to get beaver skins to make felt hats for people in Europe. And that was the original opening up economically of Canada. And that's why the voyageurs and people like Groseilliers and Radisson came all the way up the St. Lawrence, across the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi. All they were looking for was beaver to enrich themselves. The Governor-General is also the founder of all honors. That's a wonderful phrase. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The founder of all honors means that you basically give out all the bravery awards, the literary awards. They're all named for the Governor-General. And it is a very enriching and wonderful kind of post. So I was aware also of the symbolism of my appointment, but it is what Canada is. I was followed by the Right Honorable Michael Jean, who was an immigrant from Haiti and who held the post for 5 years. And on foreign visits, because that's part of your duty is to do state visits, people would often not say to me, but to the staff, how interesting. What is she? And it was unexpected, but I think that's the value of being unexpected, to surprise people, catch them off guard. And it gave a message, too, that Canada is a country of immigration. And I have a particular point of view. I'll tell you about what I think of migration when I get to the panel. But Canada's government policy is to take in 1% of our population through immigration annually. Our population is roughly the size of California, 35 million now. So we aim to take in 350,000 immigrants a year, all of whom we want to become citizens within 3 to 5 years. And within 3 to 5 years, in fact, our first Syrian immigrants who came in 2015 are up for citizenship pretty well about now. Our citizenship is quite marvelous in the way in which it happens very quickly. And so once you become a landed immigrant, then you take tests and you do various things. And we have an 85% uptake of citizenship. In the United States, it's 48%. Australia, 78%. All my life is colored by the fact that I was once unwanted, stateless, and didn't know where we were going. All I had was my family. All I had was that belief that my parents gave me, that wherever we landed, we would make our life, and we would not only do well ourselves, but we would make the place where we were better than it was than when we found it, if we could. Our immigration policy in Canada was not new. We've had our ups and downs. We've had very ugly moments. We interned the Japanese during the Second World War the way you did, people that had been born in this country, or their parents had been born in this country, and they too, and we treated them shabbily. Any amount of restitution doesn't make up for that, but we try. We've at least apologized. We've at least given some money, and that is, I suppose, a value in our kind of society. But we had an immigration policy, and we've always had an immigration policy. And we had a French-Canadian Prime Minister in 1840 who said that the world would be coming to Canada's doorstep, and we should be welcoming everybody. Not that we wanted for them to forget where they came from, but that we wanted them to be like ourselves, these are his words, Canadians. Then from 1899 to 1911, we opened up the West. We did not, although we have not treated our native population well, we did not clear the West with cowboys. We sent out the Northwest Mounted Police, which are now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who went to various forts and made it habitable for people. And then between 1899 and 1911, we opened up the West, and of course that was really, really important. Now, this morning, John A. Powell said, you know, America was formed by the Anglos and the Saxons. I want to tell you, that means, in our terms, the English gentry, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, all of those, James Madison, all of those people, they were English gentlemen on plantations with great houses. It's not the case in Canada. Canada was founded by Scottish and the Irish who had lost their causes in what's now called Great Britain. People who were outsiders, people who were not of the center. And that's, I think, why deep in our psyche we can take in everyone. The Prime Minister who presided over Confederation, John A. Macdonald, was the one who really helped to form our country. We have gone through some very dark times. The health of our society has been that we've been able to overcome these black marks and that we've made our official apologies. When I came to Canada, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still on the books, which was that you had to pay a head tax if you were Chinese to get into Canada. But they didn't pay any attention to it, and we were never charged it. But somebody doing a PhD at UBC sent me 2 years ago a photocopy of the page in which I am registered by hand by somebody. Our family is all registered, but nobody ever asked us for money. It was just there. And I think a fundamental idea that somehow it was built by white people and that only white people would care to come to whatever inhospitality the climate might give them. I think that we have to be very certain when we talk about belonging that we know what we're talking about, what we belong to. And I think it is about lateral trust. And in my book, Belonging, which was a series of radio lectures, I talk about that, the aspect of belonging in the society and the allowance for disagreement among its leaders. But I also talk about two great concepts. Ubuntu, the African concept, which says that I am a person because you are a person. And it is a statement of cohesion and coherence that accommodates all living things. It emphasizes our connectedness with each other in the past and the present and the future. And the other one is the way the Bhutanese in Bhutan measure their prosperity, not by gross national product, but gross national happiness. And gross national happiness means living in harmony and being together. The Bhutanese idea is based on the all-important Buddhist concept of interdependence, and that is what belonging is. It isn't a club, it's interdependence. It's people leaning with people, together with people. We have to emphasize the individual courage of people to be themselves in order to be with other people. When I left being GovernorGeneral, I decided that I had to have a legacy project which would reflect my life and the experiences that I had. So I founded the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and we have programs all across the country that encourage new citizens to be inclusive, embrace fresh thinking. We have something called 6 Degrees Conference, which we have every September in Canada. We've spread out over the world as well. But we have some very practical things. I wanted to do some very practical things. I didn't want it to be airy-fairy, all thinking and talking and like-minded people getting together and saying the right things. The Cultural Access Pass was my big brainstorm. We give to every Canadian citizen through my institute, and that would be every year, 250,000 new citizens, because we try to get, as I said, 1% of our population every year. We don't always make it because it takes a lot of bureaucratic time to get people in. This Cultural Access Pass is given to everybody who becomes a citizen, and it gives them the access to 1,500 cultural institutions all across the country, all the provincial parks, all the national parks for 1 year, and the lowest rate on our national train system for 1 year, in order for them to feel that they really belong, that the heritage of the past of Canadians who came before them is part of theirs, and that they can see what was there when they get here and how they will be able to contribute to it. And then we do special citizenship ceremonies in public places like city town halls, libraries. We could even done them in lobbies of hotels or public parks in the summer, where we have round tables before, where the new citizens sit with established citizens. We put out a call to people, and everybody wants to come and meet the new citizens. And then they have round table and they discuss what they've found in the country, what they've learned, what they hope to contribute themselves. And then we have the ceremony, and then we have a big cake with a big Canadian flag on it. And do you know what Tim Hortons is, the donut shop? We usually have Tim Hortons and coffee, and everybody's very happy and goes off. I think that one of the other things that belonging means is that when you belong to something, you are part of that. And so citizenship is definitely not a pick and choose thing. I always say at citizenship ceremonies to people, don't say that I don't want to be bothered with that. I don't want to think about the indigenous people. Bad was done to them before I came, and I don't have any responsibility for that. Citizenship is a fixed menu. It's not a Sunday buffet where you can say, I'll have the turkey, but I won't have the cranberry sauce, and I'll have the lobster, but not the shrimp. It's a fixed menu. And once you're adopted into a family, if you have citizenship, you owe that family your allegiance. Crazy Uncle Bob, who's an alcoholic, the gold digger aunt that you never receive at Christmas, all of that is part of your family. And you have to believe that, because that is part of what belonging means. It's taking the good with the bad. And I think that civic responsibility spreads out to where you live, and that's what we try to do through the Institute, this one large bowl and the single spoon. And the indigenous peoples have always taught us that, because their image is the circle. And they always say they only have to open their hands with one hand with another and include you in. It's not hierarchical. And belonging as a citizen means taking the good with the bad. But it doesn't mean loving everybody. Loving everybody is not going to solve it. Society is made up of people that you don't like, who don't like you, that people you don't want to sit down and have a sandwich with even. But you have to give them space just as they have given you space. And that's how you create society, through the hard work of trying to overcome what the differences are, how to chip away at the rough edges. And it's not going to be done by just love. Hope, yes, but not just love. Two things I'll leave you with. The other things that make it possible for us to belong in Canada is our public education system. I was educated, I guess people would say in the United States, or rich people would say, you were educated at the at the expense of taxes. Yes, I was, and I pay taxes now, and I'm glad that I pay them for kids who go to school. Also, healthcare is a right of every citizen in their country. And that is my final word to you. In fact, I think that if you are, like I am, a member of the ordinary Canadian public, whether I've had a role that's been very, very cherished in society, or whether you're a teacher or whatever you are, but when you are somebody who has held high office in our country, in Canada, you go back to just thinking about yourself as just the human being who believes in this public education, in the public health care, in the welcome of refugees, the open doors to immigrants, the bilingual in our two official languages in our country, and the ongoing work of reconciliation with our Indigenous people. Thank you.